Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in Saumur-Champigny and we're looking at the Antoine Sanzay 2017 Les Poyeux Saumur-Champigny. While Antoine Sanzay is the seventh generation in his family to be farming vines in and around the commune of Varennes in Saumur-Champigny, his story at the domaine really doesn't begin until 1999 when he returned to the estate full-time after completing his studies. But it wasn't until 2002 when he vinified his first vintage using his family's grapes. Up until this time, the family had been selling the grapes to the local cooperative, and when Antoine returned to the domaine, he began taking back their parcels, slowly increasing the production, and by 2014, he was vinifying his grapes from 100% of the family's parcels. Today, Antoine has around 11 hectares of vines, and all of these vines are farmed organically. And of this, around 10 hectares are Cabernet Franc. So he does have a little bit of Chenin as well. And his parcels are scattered across the communes of Varennes, Chacé, Dampierre-sur-Loire, and Saint-Cyr-en-Bourg. And today, of course, we are looking at his Les Poyeux, which is a vineyard I'm sure many of you will recognize. And this is without a doubt Antoine's top wine in his range of Cabernet Francs. And the last time I spoke about this famed vineyard of Les Poyeux was nearly a year ago when I opened a bottle of the Clos Rougeard 2009 Les Poyeux for my birthday. And since this time, my understanding of this vineyard has really increased dramatically through my research and speaking with producers, as well as now having just visited the vineyard firsthand on my recent trip to the Loire Valley. So to give you a lay of the land here, Les Poyeux is located in the commune of Chacé, and this is one of three communes in Saumur-Champigny that are set back from the Loire River, this along with Varennes and Saint-Cyr-en-Bourg. And technically, Chacé, along with Saint-Cyr-en-Bourg and also Brezay, these three communes have actually since merged, administratively speaking, into the commune of Belleville-les-Châteaux. But it is important to remember that Brezay is not part of the Saumur-Champigny appellation. It is part of the Saumur AOP. So getting back to Chacé, the commune, there are two areas of vineyards that we need to be worrying about here. On the west side of the villages of Chacé and Varennes, we have two different terroirs. We have a small area that is on the ancient alluvial soils of the Loire River, and then we have another area of vineyards that is on calcareous-based soils. And then on the east side of these villages, where we find Les Poyeux and some other lieu-dit, this area is dominated by calcareous-based soils. And while we do find both the upper Turonian and the middle Turonian tuffeau chalk here in Chacé, the majority of the lieu-dit are on the middle Turonian tuffeau chalk. So let's dive into this vineyard of Les Poyeux, which is without a doubt the most famous vineyard in Saumur-Champigny, and it has been highly prized for viticulture since the early 1800s. Now, this lieu-dit is very complex and it is by no means homogeneous. So the main part of the lieu-dit is located on the north side of the D225. This area is about 30 hectares. That's around 75 acres in terms of the size. And then there's another portion that lies south of the road, and this area is about 14 hectares. And the main area of the vineyard is on a gentle, full south to southwest facing slope. And then the western and upper portions of the lieu-dit are actually located on a full western exposure. And in terms of the altitude here, we're sitting basically between 40 and 60 meters above sea level. Now, these favorable warm exposures are likely part of the reason why this vineyard was highly prized for viticulture, dating back, as I said, to the early 1800s. These exposures are warm, and it's important to remember that it's really only been in the last 20 to 25 years that Cabernet Franc has really been able to ripen well in every vintage in the Loire. A vineyard like this with these sorts of exposures would have been highly regarded for its ability to ripen grapes better and more consistently than some other sites. And when I visited this vineyard, I did visit a number of different parcels across the site. And you can sense instantly that there is something very special going on here in terms of the terroir. You know, we have a full sun exposure during the day. There is this elevated forested area to the northeast of the vineyard, and this helps to block out any cold northerly winds that might otherwise cool down the mesoclimate of the vineyard. And, you know, seeing is believing. Standing in this site, you really do get a sense that this is a very special vineyard. Now, in terms of the soils here, it's the tale of two bedrocks. We do have both the influence of the Upper Turonian and the Middle Turonian tuffo chalk here. So in the eastern portion of the vineyard here that kind of hugs this forested area, we are on the Upper Turonian yellow tuffo chalk. This is about a third or so of the vineyard area. And then as we move west and south and then down the slope, we are on the Middle Turonian white tuffo chalk. In terms of topsoil, the central and western portions of the lieu-dit are on this combination of clay, silt, and sand. And this is articulated in French by two terms. We have limon, argileux, sableux, and we also have limon, sableux, argileux are the two terms that we use to describe the texture of these soils. And then in the eastern and upper portions of the lieu-dit, we have more sand here, and there's actually some Sannonian era sands and clays in this particular area as well. Of course, the depth of the topsoils will vary depending on the parcels. And another thing that I want to note about this vineyard is the stoniness of the parcels. And the stoniness does vary considerably. There are some parcels that have almost no stones whatsoever. Then there's some parcels that have upwards to 100% stones. And this is important. If we think back to readings on appellations like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, for example, where we know the important role that the galets roulés play in that appellation's terroirs, these stones accumulate heat during the daytime, and then they retain that heat during the evening, and then this will help to enhance ripening through the evening hours. So these stones do play an important role in terms of the various parcels and the different terroirs that we find here. Now, as I mentioned at the top of this little ramble about Les Poyeux, it is not a homogeneous vineyard. And why is this important? Well, a vineyard of this size, a lieu-dit, a climat, you know, regardless of what we call it or where it is, a vineyard of this size, there is going to be some variability from parcel to parcel. And this inevitably means that there will be some parcels that are considered better than others. And this relates to the balance in terms of soil fertility, as well as water retention, exposures, as well as a risk of chlorosis, etc. These factors will then influence the vigneral's decision as it relates to plant material, rootstocks, how they go about tending to each individual vine or row as it relates to shoot thinning and yields and that canopy balance. And this inevitably will influence sugar and phenolic ripeness and how quickly or slowly these parcels ripen. And of course, when we pick the grapes at various maturities, various sugar maturities as well as phenolic maturities, this will then influence the vigneral's decisions in the cellars, which will, of course, impact the finished wine. All this to say is that it is not possible to really say, well, what is Les Poyeux as a wine, as a vineyard, because you really do need to understand, well, who is the vigneral, where are their parcels, what part of the vineyard are they in, and then how are they treating that fruit in the cellar to figure out, well, what can we maybe then expect in the finished wine. So with that said, let's talk about Antoine's parcel. So he has 4 hectares here in Les Poyeux. He has 2 in the upper portion that's on the western side of the lieu-dit. So we do have that full western exposure. And then we have 2 hectares in the southern portion on the south side of the D225 that is in the center here of this particular section. In terms of the vine age, his vines are around 50 to 55 or so years of age. And then in terms of the bedrock, all of his parcels are on the Middle Turonian tuffo chalk. And then in terms of topsoil, his topsoil is actually pretty consistent across all of his parcels. So we have that clay, silt, sand mix. So we're talking about 25% clay content. And then in terms of his parcels, the topsoil depth ranges, I would say it's relatively shallow across the board, ranges from about 20 to 60 or so centimeters, with the top of the slope being more shallow and then the bottom of the slope being a little bit on the deeper side. The last thing I want to note about Antoine's parcels is they are quite stony, and these stones, like I said, they make a difference as far as the microclimate or the mesoclimate of these particular parcels. And when I was in the vineyard with Antoine, I was picking up the stones, and at 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, after seeing all day sun, they are quite warm. So the stones play an important role in terms of the terroir here for sure. Now, another thing to note about Antoine and his approach with his Les Poyeux parcels is that in the case of the 2017 vintage, he did actually blend all of the parcels. So all 4 parcels, all 4 hectares, I should say, are in this particular bottling. But depending on the vintage, he may actually separate some of his Les Poyeux parcels, and then those may then get blended into his domaine or pattern bottling rather than the Les Poyeux. From a winemaking perspective, there's a few things I do want to note about Antoine's approach in the cellar. First and foremost, hand-picked fruit, destemmed fruit, 100%. And he is doing his fermentations with 100% whole berry. And he does take a lot of care and attention in how he gets the fruit from the destemmer into the vat without the use of pumps in order to avoid breaking the skin and releasing any astringent tannins. So the whole berry is an important element to his approach to fermentation. So, as I said, we're dealing with whole berry fermentation, and it's all with indigenous yeast in concrete vats. And then the wine spends about 28 days on skins, and he does very little by way of extractive techniques during this time. Some light pump overs at the beginning of fermentation and kind of as needed in order to ensure that the cap stays nice and moist. But otherwise, we are dealing with extraction via infusion here. Another thing I want to note about Antoine's approach in the cellar is that he does separate his free-run juice and his pressed juice, and he only uses the free-run juice in the finished cuvee. From an élevage perspective, as it relates specifically to this wine spent about 18 months in a combination of older 600-liter oak barrels as well as oak foudre. So let's get into this wine. So the nose has a real wonderful freshness to it, and it is I would say it is immediately red fruit dominant here, and it's a mix of sweet and some savory red fruits. Like there's a bit of cherry here, a little bit of raspberry, there's a little snappy, tart, small red berry like a lingonberry or a red currant or something here. There is also a little touch of like a wild blueberry note as well. And then in terms of the pyrazines or that noble vegetal note or those herbaceous notes, I do say that they come through at a moderate level, but I do like the complexity of the herbal undertones. I'm getting some twiggy herbs like thyme and rosemary. There's a little bit of an underbrush thing going on, a bit of cedarwood. There's even something slightly minty about the nose as well, which I quite like. And there is a little bit of a floral thing going on here too, but it's definitely not violets. It's more like a pink flower, kind of like peony. But the nose is very pure fruited. There's a nice translucency, a nice clarity to the nose in terms of the profile. Now, on the palate, those same fruits come through really nicely, and there is, like I said, it leans a little bit more, I think, perhaps more savory on the palate, which I like. We're getting some tertiary elements here from a little bit of bottle age, which is awesome. There is a bit of a spice undertone here, but allspice, a touch of graphite as well. Now, in terms of the acidity is really bright, really lively, and it hits right smack dab in the middle of the cheeks. And this signals something to me, that we have a vineyard here where we have a stronger impact of the tuffeau. And this is what I'm noticing when I'm tasting Cabernet Franc from limestone soils, is that it really tends to hit here on the sides of the cheeks. And that gives this sensation of almost cinching in, creating that corseted effect, creating a sensation that this wine is a little bit more linear and focused rather than broad on the palate. And in terms of the overall weight of this wine, this is a medium-bodied wine. It's by no means heavy or full-bodied, and there is a certain, ethereal character here. There's concentration, but it's not super dense. It does have some levity to it. And in terms of the texture of the tannins are very fine. There's a moderate amount of tannin here, sufficient structure, that in combination with the acidity. The tannins are very velvety, and they do have a really nice chalkiness, chalky minerality to the finish as well. Even getting, now that I'm kind of retasting and it's starting to kind of open up and relax a little bit, there's a little bit of nice mushroom thing coming on the palate, which is really nice. And part of the reason why we like to hang on to wines for a little bit, to see how those, the baby fat gets shed and how the wine kind of matures. But the one thing I do want to note about Antoine's bottling of Les Poyeux, and I noticed this in my tastings with him in his cellar with some newer vintages of Les Poyeux, is that all of the wines have a very distinct balance and equilibrium that is just inherent in the glass. It's this integration between the fruit, the acid, the tannins, the weight, the concentration. His expression of Les Poyeux is extremely harmonious, and I think that is obviously a testament to his quality of farming, as well as his parcels and the quality of the parcels that he has. But this is a really beautiful wine, and it's a premium or premier example of Cabernet Franc from Saumur-Champigny, and certainly a bottling of Les Poyeux that I would recommend folks seek out. If you have had Antoine's Les Poyeux, do let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Or if you've had the pleasure of tasting another vigneron's Les Poyeux, whether it be Claude Rougard or someone else, let me know who it was and what you thought of that wine in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.